Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to the August 2019 Mississippi PowerShell User Group meeting. Tonight we've got Mike Kanakos. He's going to be presenting PowerShell remoting from zero to lockdown in 45 minutes. Take it away, Mike.
Oh, thank you, Mike, and welcome everybody. Thanks for having me this evening. Just a quick rundown. I can see the chat, so if anybody has any questions and you don't feel like speaking, you can simply type something in the chat and I'll do my best to get to questions. So I just presented this topic a couple of days ago at the Chattanooga PowerShell Saturday event, and I'm happy to do it again. I think this is information that's useful for everybody. So if you've never heard me speak or anything like that, I'm pretty straightforward. I like to present about stuff that is like everyday useful stuff that you can take right back to work and use. So, and that's sort of what this topic is. This topic today, we're going to be talking about remoting from zero to lockdown, which basically means I am going to be talking about all the foundational stuff, and then I'll go through all the options and show you different ways you can use stuff. So this presentation doesn't have any live demos per se, because I've taken all the demos and I've put them in the slides. And the reason for that is because you're going to see remoting is very simple to set up and it's pretty simple to understand. The problem with remoting is mostly misinformation. So if you guys could help me out here for a second, you don't have to respond verbally if you don't prefer, but is there anybody on the call that has been told by their work that they're not allowed to run remoting at work? Because that is how I got my start with this topic. I was told last year that I was not able to use remoting at work. And the reason for this talk is because I had to do the work to figure out if remoting was going to be feasible to use at work. So I figured I would take that information and put it in a digestible form to share with people. So with that being said, let's get started. All right. So I called this talk Zero to Lockdown 45 minutes because I want to walk people through how to get started with remoting and all the things associated with it. But you could also call this talk Selling PS Remoting to Your Security Team. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of organizations that simply will not allow you to use remoting because PowerShell is in the news a lot of times for the wrong reasons. People think that enabling PowerShell is going to put you in some sort of situation that's going to be a detriment for your company. And I'm basically here to tell you that that's not really the case, but rather than me tell you, you shouldn't just take my word for it, I want to show you the why. So we're going to talk about the configs and all the things that come with it, but the goal here is really twofold. Hopefully when you go back to work, there'll be something you can get that's useful out of this that you can use on the very first day back to work, even if it's just simple understanding of how the processes work. But more importantly, I would like to make it so that you are comfortable to have a conversation with your security team if they are giving you any grief about how this technology works. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Mike Kanakos. I am a sysadmin and AD engineer. I use PowerShell pretty much every day, and I'm pretty active in the community. And I would be more than happy to reach out and have a conversation with anybody. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on Twitter and email. Just send me any kind of message. I'd be happy to respond and answer any questions I have for you. You have for me, excuse me. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to go over what actually is PS remoting, clear up any misnomers. We'll talk about how does it work, and is it safe, how you authenticate, and then we're going to talk about the networking protocols behind PowerShell remoting. What's the difference between WMI and SIM? I'll show you how you can enable remoting. It's super simple. We'll talk a little bit about how you can control access. And then I'm going to spend the end of the talk talking about something that most people find a mystery as well, which is logging PowerShell activity. So we're going to start with foundational stuff, but then we'll move on to stuff that you can customize to make this your own environment. But the reason, one of the things I wanted to say is, why do you need this stuff? Why do you need to know this? Could you just turn on remoting and walk away? And of course you could do that. But I think that if you're worried about the ramifications of turning on remoting, then you need to understand that you actually have to dig in and do the research yourself. And the reason for that is because if you look online, there's just a lot of misinformation. And I'm sad to say that a lot of it is wrong. Now, there's nothing wrong with searching for articles and trying to figure out what to do. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of little nuances to this. And if you don't sort of figure it out on your own, you could be led down the wrong path. And I am of the belief that if you're a sysadmin or any kind of person who has the ability to control things on your network, you really need to know what runs on your network, and not only what runs, but how it works. And lastly, I'll say that if you are someone that has people at work that may be conservative or not willing to let you use something like remoting, then, obviously, the more you know, the better off you can be in helping dispel those myths and explain why remoting not only is safe, but is beneficial to use in your environment. It helps you do what you do. So as I said earlier, I hope you take away a few things from this. The first is something you can use immediately. The second is that you'll be more comfortable to talk about this stuff with the people who may not be showing you enough love about about the ability to run in your network. So we'll start with the really basic stuff. We're going to do all the foundational stuff here. So just to get everybody on the same page, remoting is a tool, and specifically PowerShell remoting is a tool that is designed for admins to securely run commands on remote systems. Now, I want you to understand something, that remoting, PS remoting, is really meant for admins. And I will talk about that more later, but it's designed for an admin first. PowerShell remoting runs on top of the Windows Remote Management Service, known as WinRM, and that service uses the WSMan protocol, Web Services for Management. And when you hear web services, you should immediately start thinking about protocols that would be used in web services. So we're talking about HTTP and HTTPS. And the goal here is to understand that that protocol is going to allow for you to be able to make secure, authenticated, and encrypted connections between computers. WSMan is not a Microsoft protocol. It's Microsoft taking an open standard and using it in their application toolkit. I do want you to understand, though, that PS remoting is very safe and you should not fear using it. I will point out to you why you may not want to use it, but it's not going to be because of remoting. It's going to be for other reasons. But before we can go into any of that, we really need to talk about how remoting works. So let me make sure I got my little laser pointer on here. Laser pointer. Okay, yeah. So this computer right here on the left, that's going to represent our computer, our local machine. All right, and this computer over here is going to represent a remote connection, and I'm going to basically detail how a remote session works. So there's 4 pieces to this conversation that happens that you need to be aware of. It's not the complete picture, but for our conversation tonight, this is the stuff that you need to kind of understand. So the first thing that happens is if you launch PowerShell on your machine, you are authenticated. Now, you may not realize that you're being authenticated because when you Control-Alt-Deleted to log into your machine in the morning, that's when you're authenticated. If you just clicked on PowerShell, then you just got a PowerShell prompt. But that prompt knows who you are. And when you invoke a remote session, it's that ID that you're using that's going to be passed along to the remote session for authentication. If you were to launch PowerShell remoting, PowerShell command prompt as alternate credentials, you would be prompted to log in, and then it would know about those credentials. As well as if you ran it with any alternate credentials in a script, same basic idea. The concept here that I'm trying to get across is that your session is running as a user, and the computers are aware of who that is. When you reach out to the machine on the other side through the use of certain commandlets, enter PS session, invoke command, or the sim commandlets, you are using PowerShell remoting under the hood to connect to the other machine and make a session between the two machines. When you hit that other machine, you're going to be authenticated to figure out who you are and what privileges you have on the remote machine. So, and based on your group membership on the remote machine, it will determine your privileges. And the way that this all works, I mentioned earlier, is these two protocols and the two ports, HTTP and HTTPS, going to make an encrypted connection between the machines. Now, on this diagram, this may look like a VPN tunnel, but it's not. It's a session. And what happens is, when you type commands on this machine here, those commands are going to be sent over to the remote machine, and they'll be processed, and eventually that data will come back to your local machine. And whether you do this for one machine or 100 machines in your network, the process is basically the same. You will reach out to a remote machine, you'll be authenticated. Once you're authenticated, you'll be granted rights based on your group membership on the remote machine. A session will be established, and transactions will go back and forth. PowerShell keeps track of all that stuff through something called run space IDs, which you don't need to know about, but that's how it does it. And the data comes back to the local machine, and whatever is brought back is reassembled into a usable format, depending on the based on the commands that you typed, and is presented for you on the screen or through variables, as things like that. So I covered a lot right there in a very short time. I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Is that I didn't lose anybody yet, right? If you have a question, feel free to throw it in the chat, and we can take a second and talk about anything that might not seem might not be understood. All right, good job. So Tim asked about, does authentication rely on Active Directory? And absolutely it does. I'm going to detail that in a little bit, but to just foreshadow a little bit, when you connect to a remote machine, PS remoting is designed to work with Active Directory, and when you connect to that remote machine, Kerberos is how you are authenticated, which basically means your domain controller is figuring out who you are and telling that remote computer that you are who you are, and then presents the group membership information. So yes, it is Active Directory that is doing the work there, unless you're talking about a work group scenario, which I'm going to talk about in a sec. So if we go back to the beginning here, I had said, is remoting safe? And I just want to highlight that the reason to do this work is to figure out on your own, because if you go out and you look on the internet, there's plenty of people asking the same exact question, and much of the information is not consistent. It can be vague. So by learning these pieces, you'll know for yourself, you can answer very, very confidently that PowerShell is safe. But before we could talk about if it is safe or is not safe, I think we need to figure out what is happening in the world of malware and how is it being used to sort of attack networks. So right now, most attacks that happen are happening using PowerShell of some sort. Hackers just can power through machines using PowerShell. Doesn't leave a lot of footprints. Hackers and attackers like it for the same reason that we do. It's powerful, it's easy to use, you can accomplish a lot in a short amount of time, and those are all the things that they like to do as well. IBM has found that less than half of the attacks that were used in 2018 didn't even have files. It all ran in memory. It's all done in PowerShell and others. So they didn't have to change file systems. They just got the data they needed and they left. So PowerShell is really being used as a downloader and for lateral movement. And that's going to be important in a few slides, you'll see. What makes it rough is that organizations, they don't really do a good job of monitoring. So when you get on the network, you can move around pretty much unencumbered because no one's really watching. And attackers know that, so they don't even need to cover their tracks anymore. And as you see, not many files are being obfuscated or even trying to be hidden. So the point is, PowerShell can be used for some pretty bad things. But the question is PowerShell safe? Is remoting safe? And I am here to tell you, yes, I'm taking a long time to get to the part of why, but I want you to understand that you can't rely on everything you read in the news to make the decision about is PowerShell remoting safe for you to use environment. So I want you to understand that it's safe, but I want you to know the why. I don't want you to take what I say as verbatim. I want you to make educated decisions based on what I tell you. You can verify this information independently, but I think by the end of this, you're going to realize I really have nothing to worry about here, and it's pretty easy to set up. So with that being said, the one thing that you really need to understand more than anything about remoting is nothing more than a connection between two nodes. And it's the handshake that happens when those two nodes talk. So I like to talk about this as the road between two houses. So I'm going to use a little illustration here to explain my point. So let's imagine we have a network of computers, and the green locks represent the local security on those computers. And the blue lines are going to represent what we would consider network, or probably more appropriate for this conversation, remote connections between computers. So if I had told you that the security on the computers was so tight and so secure that no connections could be made between the computers, I think you would be understanding that remoting couldn't do anything. So if we took that concept and we sort of turned it on its head, and we got rid of the local security, and we basically just replaced it with like some wide open security or very low security, then I think it stands to reason that remoting would be able to do quite a bit. So the reason I bring this point out is to illustrate that nothing has changed in this diagram with remoting. The only thing that's changed is the end node security on the end machine that you're going to connect to. And that is probably the most critical thing that you need to understand about remoting. Remoting is the road between two nodes and the handshake when you get there. If I said to you that you were going to go to the neighbor's house across the street and you walked across the street, when you got to the other side, if the door was wide open, that has nothing to do with the road that got you there. Conversely, if the door is locked and you can't get in, that also has nothing to do with the road. The point being here is if you have very weak security on your end nodes, then remoting is going to be a bad thing for you. But at the same time, if you work in an organization where every user is a local admin on their end computer, that's not remoting's fault if an attacker can get in and move around the network. You allowed that to happen. The same is true if we had a network of lots of domain admins, or if we had help desk staff that were local admins on every end user's computer so that they can connect to them and help them. The point being, the thing that you have to worry about remoting is not remoting if it's on or off, but how strong is your security at the machines that they're going to go to. So that's really the thing that you need to understand more than anything. We talked about authentication a little earlier. Let's dive into that a little bit more. I had said your local PowerShell session authenticates against a remote machine. You enter when you use a certain set of commands that invokes remoting, and remoting will connect to the remote machine, and your identity will be looked up, as Tim alluded to earlier, via Active Directory and the Kerberos protocol. Domain controller will authenticate you, and then you will be allowed access based on your group membership on the remote machine. If you are working in a workgroup situation, you don't have a domain, that same thing will happen with NTLM, which obviously is not as secure as Kerberos, but is still an authenticated protocol and still offers some level of security. So you authenticate against the machine. What happens next? There's two groups on the computer that control and dictate what you get access to. So this concept is no different than if you understand how remote desktop works. In remote desktop, you most likely understand, and if you don't, I'll explain it in detail, but administrators are assumed to have remote desktop access. So if you're in the administrators group here, you are given, as it says here, complete and unrestricted access to the computer. That also means you can make a remote connection via remote desktop. Conversely, if you did not have administrator access and you wanted to give someone access to the remote machine, you would place them in the remote desktop users group. And that would give them the ability to remote into a machine, and they would have user level access, which is basically read access. The same exact process exists for PowerShell remoting. If you're an administrator, part of the local administrators group, you have complete control over the machine via PowerShell remoting. If you do not have administrator access, you can assign someone to the remote management users group. And as you can see here, this allows them to access WMI resources over things like WSMan using WinRM. So if you understand remote desktop, PS remoting works in the same basic way. If you have no security on your machine and you allow everybody to be a local administrator, then you can remote desktop anywhere and you can PS remote anywhere. Now, there's just one thing I want to point out here. This message here says WMI. In the previous slide, I mentioned when you invoke via the SIM commandlets. So this is probably a good time to talk about the difference between SIM and WMI. I find that most people don't know what the difference is, but they have some idea that SIM is good and WMI is bad. Does anybody have an idea why? I'll show you that, but if you think you know why, throw it in the chat, and we could talk about that a little bit. So the dirty little secret is that SIM and WMI are essentially the same. And I know that might sound a little confusing right now. I'm going to try to explain that to you. But there's a small nuance between them. The small nuance has big ramifications, but they're basically the same. WMI is simply Microsoft's version of an open standard called the Common Information Model, SIM. I see Mike typing something in the chat, so I'm just going to take a second to let him catch up. And while he's typing, I'll go on and say that when SIM was created a long time ago, so that's like a little bit more deeper in the weeds, Mike, than I was looking for. Mike had typed that SIM returns serialized objects that have no methods. Certainly not wrong, but a little different than what I'm going for here, and I'll explain. So Mike Robbins is correct. What WMI uses DCOM, which I'm going to highlight in a second. But the point being is that SIM is a protocol that was put in place many years ago, and when the standard was created, there was no specification for networking. So Microsoft took what they already had and added it to the SIM protocol so that they could exchange information, the SIM standard, so they could exchange information back and forth between machines. So they took DCOM and RPC and added that to the SIM protocol, SIM standard, and called it WMI. So the only difference between SIM and WMI is how data is transferred. SIM is about accessing information on the machine. WMI has some add-ons to allow you to transfer data back and forth. Well, you know, WMI doesn't have the best reputation for security. Mike says only if you create a SIM session first. Correct. In 2012, Microsoft went back and looked at WMI and knew that they could do a little better. They made a new version of WMI, but they didn't give it a unique name. And this new version, the only difference is it uses this WSMan protocol that we talked about earlier. So if you remember, WSMan means secure, authenticated, encrypted, right? Versus DCOM RPC that doesn't have all those pieces. Now, Microsoft didn't choose to give this a unique name, so it sort of took on a life of its own. Many people call this new version SIM. So SIM was always here. Microsoft creates WMI. They make a new version. People call it SIM. Microsoft names SIM commandlets after it. It gets a little confusing, but the point is In essence, the SIM protocol, also known as WRM, is using a more secure model to transfer data than the WMI protocol. That's the essential difference that you need to be aware of. Again, so remoting, we're talking about authentication, encryption, Kerberos for authentication, domain authentication. So there's a lot of things built into remoting to make this a secure protocol. Now, I can show you this to you. I can show you that SIM and WI are essentially the same. So if we take a look at the screenshot here, here's the exact same command run via WMI object and get SIM instance. Now this is just querying on a local machine, but if you notice, they query the exact same set of data. The only difference would be here is if I was transferring this to another machine, it would be using a different protocol. But they're accessing the same information store, just proving my point that they started from the same beginnings. So a quick review here. SIM is a little more firewall friendly. It only needs 2 ports to run, HTTP and HTTPS, and we talked about authentication via Kerberos. In a domain, it's using your domain controls are handling authentication. It's all handled by the WSMAN protocol at the bottom of the stack there. As opposed to WMI, less firewall friendly, has some well-known ports that are used that most people don't want to use, also has some dynamically assigned ports, as well as those protocols that nobody really is in love with anymore. So you can see just making the switch from SIM to WMI increases your security posture a lot, but you're actually accessing the data basically in the same way. So I had told you earlier that I didn't have a lot of demos in here because this is very easy stuff to do. Enabling remoting in your environment is really simple. If you've never done it, Microsoft gives you 2 ways to do it from the command line. There's 2 commands. One is called WinRM Quick Config, and the other one is called Enable PS Remoting. And they essentially do the same thing. They end up at the same spot. They just take a little different path to get there. So if you wanted to know, is remoting configured on my machine, you would run WinRM Quick Config, and it would tell you the status before it makes any changes. And then if you answer yes, it will configure your machine for remoting, as opposed to enable remoting, which assumes that you want to do this, and it just goes ahead and enables it for you. So when I say enables your machine for remoting, what we're doing is we're setting up your machine to accept connections from other machines. You don't ever set up initiating connections because that is something you're going to do through your commandlets. You're setting up your machine to accept connections from others. Now, if we're talking about a domain situation, you're probably going to think about doing this with group policy. There is absolutely nothing wrong with doing it from the command line, but if you have 500 computers, you're probably not going to go to the command line for 500 connections. If you're going to you can do the exact same thing that the commandlets do via group policy, you just have to follow a little bit of a different path. When you do it through group policy, you're doing the same things that the commandlet does. It's just broken into 3 individual distinct steps: enabling the service, setting the service to auto start on the next boot, and then poking a hole through your client firewall if you're using a firewall so that the connection can be made. I'm going to walk you through how to do it. It's very simple, and you'll see it's not very hard concept to understand. So if you're familiar with group policy, you'll know that you have a number of options you can set. This path at the bottom here is how you would find the setting in group policy, and it's simply enable or disable. So in this case, I would like to enable this policy, and then I have a choice to do some IP filtering. I'm going to ask you to hold on that for a second. We're going to come back to that. But in this case, I would set it to enabled, and then group policy allows me the ability to deploy that to the domain, to just a group, to a site, to an organization unit. I have a lot of options there. The same process exists for the 2 other pieces. I would set my service to be automatic. You see the path is down here. And then I could do the same thing. Apply that to the domain, site, OU, or by group. And then the last piece is poking a hole in the firewall, which Microsoft has made easy for us as well. It's a predefined rule in group policy. It's called Windows Remote Management. You simply drop down and pick the rule. Here's the path to get to that in the group policy. And then the same thing, you choose where to deploy that. So at this point is where we're starting to get to the point where we're switching from remoting on, that's a choice, on or off. It's a binary choice. We're going to start to move into where we can make choices about what we do with our environment. And this is where you're going to start to see that you can really start to tailor and dial down what you can and cannot do with remoting. So we'll go back for a second here to our accessing remote nodes. We have some choices, remember, to think about who we're going to give access to. So as I said, if they're administrators, you're going to get access by default. If you want to give access to a subset of people, but you don't want to give them administrator access, you're going to leverage that remote management users group, and that's going to be equal to like read access, and you can think of that as running get commands from PowerShell. And I brought that up as a review because here we're going to configure that in group policy. So group policy, Active Directory and your local machines have this concept of restricted groups. Restricted groups are basically the built-in groups that come with the Active Directory and are common on all the machines. Administrators, remote desktop users, remote management users, backup users, power users. You get the idea. So in this example here, there is a domain called R2. I'm just stating that because it's a little confusing. And someone is creating a group called PowerShell Remoting in Active Directory. They're taking that group and they're going to say, I want to apply it to the remote management users on local machines. So effectively what they're doing is they're saying, I want to apply a group from my Active Directory to the local machine, and whenever I put someone in that group in Active Directory, that's going to grant them access to have remoting access on the local machine. And by doing this, you can configure a lot of machines very quickly. And if you're a little bit creative with your policies, you can do this at the domain level and assign access to, say, all the machines at one time, or you can say things like, well, my help desk staff only needs to have access to desktops. I have a server administration staff, they only need servers. I have application team members, they only need certain machines. So you can really start to dial down who gets access to where. And it's a very simple process to do. And you know, group policy, machines check in every 45 minutes randomly. So if I configure this in my environment, approximately an hour after I'm done, remoting is set up and I'm good to go. How am I doing with everybody? Am I keeping everybody together? Everybody still with me? Again, any questions, feel free to just chime them out, yell them out there. I wanted to go back to filtering a little bit. So this is a little bit more of a nuanced discussion, but if anybody has experience configuring firewalls, you know that there's this concept of source and destination. And this is what we're going to do here. We're going to talk about what sources can make it to me, the end user. Right? When we talk about remoting, we're about accepting connections into our machines. So I can use this IP filtering to get creative here. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So before I said you enable WinRM and then you configure IP filtering. So you can use this in a number of ways. But the best way to sort of illustrate this is to give you a little story. So imagine you have a network of 500 computers, and that network has 30 people who are responsible for administrative tasks. That's your domain administrators, help desk staff, client services, and so on and so forth. You could argue that out of 500 computers or 500 users, if there's only 30 people who are doing something that need remoting, the other 470 don't. So wouldn't it be great if I could say that Sally in accounting or Joe in HR or somebody in marketing, they could never start a PS remoting session. If their machine was ever attacked and someone jumped onto their machine, they wouldn't be able to move throughout the network from those machines. And the way that you can do that is exactly right here. By using IP filtering, I can say, hey, I want to allow connections to my machine from only a predetermined set of sources. And those sources can be a variable amount of things. So for example, let's say all your administrators at your network are all working from the same IP range. You could set in here 10.6.15.x if you had an administrator VLAN. And that would say only computers on that network could make it to my computer. So they may try to connect, but my machine is going to deny the connection. If you didn't have an administrator VLAN, you could put individual IPs in here. You could use stars to do wildcards. Or you could do something like, let's say, you use jump boxes at work, and you want to force everybody to do remoting, but they can only initiate connections from jump boxes. So maybe you have 5 jump boxes, like terminal servers. You could put the IPs of the 5 servers in that window there, and when applied to the machines, that'll say basically any connections that come to my machine from anything but these 5 machines will be dropped. So by doing that, I've reduced my attack surface tremendously by simply filtering down the places that remoting can be started from. So when you start to think about IP filtering combined with who I give access to in those groups, administrators and remote management, I really can get very granular with who can do what in my network. And as you go through this journey, think about the original question is remoting safe? Absolutely it is safe. It just depends on the controls that you enable. If you don't want to do it at the group policy, or if you have work group machines, you can configure one-off connections. They're called trusted hosts. And what you see in this example is a screenshot of my machine. I did a get command to say, show me my trusted host list. And by default, I trust nobody. That's the default setting. So I could go in here and I could set this to say, set item, this is PowerShell, I want to trust PCO1. So what this means in English is, I want to allow PCO1 to make connections to my machine. And I'm simply doing here a get to show you that what I just typed in is now reflected in the list. If I had multiple machines in here, this would be a comma-separated list that would go out as far as it would let me go. If I wanted to clear that out, it's a simple command to set it back. And here we see we're just doing another get to show you the value was back to nothing. So you have the option of doing this on a global scale with group policy and getting granular with how you want to do it. Or if you want to do it on one-off, you can use PowerShell and you can configure which machines you trust to make connections to you. So you see, by learning a couple of the little pieces, you really can understand the nuances of remoting and how you can really tailor it to your environment. So let's wrap up remoting. There's really 5 areas to concern yourself. It's very simple to turn on remoting. You're going to set that WinRM service to auto start. You're going to use either group policy or the command line option to enable WinRM. You have to poke a hole in the firewall. I hope we're using firewalls, but if you're not, that doesn't pertain to you. But if you are, you need to poke a hole in your client firewall so you can successfully make that connection. But then after you get past those first 2, you have to start to put some thought into what you want to be allowed. I need to decide who gets access and where connections can come from. And then lastly, I really have to think about how am I going to configure all this? Group policy, command line, bake it into an image. You have choices. So the reason I didn't show you much about remoting demos is because that's all there is to it. Essentially, turning on remoting is one command from the command line, enable PS remoting. When you do that, your machine is automatically configured to accept connections. If you don't tailor it down, it will accept connections from anybody. So there's not a lot to configure remoting. It's really about the end node security that determines how far someone can get with remoting. So there is another piece to remoting that I'm not going to talk about because it can get very long on its own, and that's certificates. Because everything I've talked about so far has basically been about authenticating users. If you wanted to authenticate the validity of a computer that is actually making the connection, You would use certificates to verify that the computer is making connection is who it says it is. So if you have a certificate environment set up in your environment, you can issue certificates pretty easily through Active Directory to all your workstations and all your servers, and that would allow you to leverage that second port of remoting, the 5986. I would recommend that you do that if you had the wherewithal to do that, but certificates is not an easy concept to grasp if you have never done it before. But once you introduce certificates into the mix, you've basically authenticated the user and the computer. And then we're going to move on to some logging here.
Hey, Mike, we got a question about in group policy. What's the folder path for the WinRM service policy?
Let's go back there. WinRM, that's earlier one, so we're going to go back. Whoops, I think I went too far. I don't remember the path off the top of my head, and I don't want to give you guys the wrong information. So it's computer config, policies, admin templates, Windows components, and then there'll be a WinRM section, and then there'll be a section for the WinRM service. So you see right here. And I'll make these slides available for anybody who would like them, and happy to share any notes I have. So since you asked about that, I'll just breeze through this real quick. So that's the path for remoting. The path for the remote management service is in a little bit different spot. I'll give you a second in case anybody wants to screenshot that. And then lastly, the firewall settings are in a completely different area. So does anybody else have any other questions that they need me to clarify, or anything that didn't seem straightforward?
So if you're using remoting with, say, Azure, I'm guessing that certificates are enabled by default, because I know it uses port 5986 instead of 5985.
I believe so, but when you say remoting with Azure, are you saying from your machine to the Azure cloud?
Yes.
That's a good question, because so if you did that, yeah. However, I don't know if that's a 100% true statement, because you could have a standalone machine that doesn't have a cert, or a domain machine that doesn't have a cert issued to it. So I don't know that the certificate is actually coming into play there, even though the port might be in use.
Okay.
So the thing I want to drive home to people is, if you're going to consider remoting, especially on-prem, you should really consider logging as coming along with it. And the reason for that is because if we go back to our security examples from earlier, if someone is on your network, you don't have a way to know unless you can track their activity. And the method to do that in the Active Directory Windows world is logging. So I'm going to talk about the three areas of logging and show you how you can, some examples of how you can use them and what they look like. So PowerShell offers module logging, script block logging, and transcription. And each one is unique to itself. But the thing that you have to understand is the previous things that I talked about with remoting is on or off, and then you can configure some of the other things. These options are totally up to you. There is no right thing that I can tell you to configure that works for every environment. It's going to be a combination of these three things that is going to ultimately give you the information that you want, that makes your security team happy and doesn't impact your users too much. So let's go through and talk about them a little bit. And the first one is module logging, and that is when you want to record all activity related to a specific PowerShell module. So you would configure which module you want to record for lack of a better term, and anytime that command is a command from that module is invoked, that will be recorded to the event logs. I started with module logging because it's the biggest of the three in terms of volume. The logs are going to be written to the PowerShell log, but under certain circumstances, you can get an extremely large amount of noise with module logging. It's probably the one that you're going to use maybe the least, but I wanted to talk about it and show you how it works. In all these scenarios, you're going to need to increase your logs to really make this stuff effective. So if that number looks scary, 1 gig for logs, I will tell you it's scary to me too, because I'm not used to seeing those kinds of sizes. But the reason that is logging doesn't work if you can't go back and look at the logs. If you have logging turned on and your logs are too low and the logs roll over, meaning the maximum size of the logs filled up, so it starts purging the oldest events, you go to look at those logs and there's nothing there to look at, you might as well just have logging shut off if you can't go back and get that history. If you happen to work in an environment that has like a SIM or a log archiver or something like that, maybe this isn't as big a deal for you, but I can tell you that's a challenge in my environment, so we had to increase our logs on the servers to compensate for some of these things. Most of these things are going to be configured via group policy. That's probably the easiest way to do that. For all 3 logs options, you can configure them in the exact same spot. We're going to talk about module logging, and you're going to see these are very simple choices. They're either on or off. So in this case, for logging modules, I set it to enabled, and then I picked the module names that I want to enable, want to monitor. So in this example here, we're going to see we're going to log activity for the SMB share. Show you what that looks like. So if I go back to my machine and I was to type the command get SMB share, I'm going to see the shares that are available on my machine. What that's going to do is, since this is a command in that module, it's going to log that activity. One event log entry, you see it's in the PowerShell log here, and you see a very clear picture of what it captures. So it clearly denotes the command here that was run. This yellow is going to highlight information about the environment that ran it, as well as who ran it. You'll also get some of your basic logging information, like the log, the event ID, time, things like that. Notice you're not seeing anything else except the actual command that was run. So there is some other stuff that's down here in the bottom, but really this is about capturing, hey, that command was fired. The sort of the inverse of that, module logging was very specific. Script block logging can be a lot more generalized. So script block logging is going to be grabbing anything that runs a block of code. So if you run a script, any PS1 file, anything in that PS1 file is going to be logged. If you run an invoke command, -computer, you know it goes -script block, anything in those curly braces is going to be logged. So it can be really useful. It has some built-in event IDs that it logs to. But the interesting thing about script block logging is you may not realize this, but it's already on in your environment, whether you configured it or not. It's just to what level of detail. And I say that because Microsoft has sort of saw the value of script block logging in that not only have they given us an opportunity to log, they have gone ahead and figured out some things about PowerShell that are there's some patterns that are very obvious. The way you and I use PowerShell every day is different than attackers use PowerShell. And the syntaxes are very distinct. An attacker will usually use obfuscated code, different types of commands, different series of commands, different ways of typing the commands. So Microsoft has already profiled that information, and when they see that activity in your environment, it's automatically logged for you to the event logs. That's the part that's on by default. When you go and turn on script block logging, you're saying, I want to turn it on for everything else. So even if you never turn on script block logging, you could have entries in your logs based on what it thinks is suspicious activity. Script log logging produces less logs than module logging, but it's still a lot. Same thing, turn it on, it's very simple to do. As I mentioned, they're all in the same spot. Same thing as before. Enable or disable, you have one choice here, start and stop events. And what this will do, this will log anytime a script block was invoked, it'll say the time that it was invoked and the time that the block ended. And the reason that's a little important is, if you remember earlier, I mentioned that a script block is going to be anything inside of PS1 or inside the curly braces. That could be very lengthy. Event log has a fixed size on how much data can be saved in an entry. So if you are capturing logs for an event that took up more than what can be held in one log entry, Microsoft's going to split that apart and put it over multiples. So the reason that's important to know is that there's some very simple code that you can download that will put together those logs into one complete picture if you are trying to figure out what happened. But if you were doing that and you were reading the logs, you would want to know when the script block started and when the script block ended. And the only way you would know that is if you checked off this box. So here's what it looks like when you have a script block logging entry. So we have one entry here. You can see it's in the PowerShell log. You can see who ran it. Some basic information. Here's a computer name. Okay. And we see here that this script block logging captured the command get Windows feature. And as I said, this ran inside the test.ps1 script. So that's really useful information. And it's very clear and easy to understand. Let's move on to probably the most misunderstood logging feature that Microsoft offers, transcription. So if you've ever dealt with start transcript or stop transcript, this is exactly the same thing. The way it works is the two other items that I discussed are logging to the event log. Transcription is doing a different option. It's writing to flat log files, flat text files on the machine that's running the commands. They're broken out by user and session, and they're simply text files that anybody can open. Now that may seem a little crazy at first. Why would you want that? I'll try to explain that. But before I do, you just have to know that transcription captures everything. The good and the bad. Usernames, passwords, encryption keys, API keys, paths to servers, share. I mean, you think anything you can think of, it's going to be in that log. So you really want to think about how you use this, because it can be used against you. It could become a detriment. If you have people that are changing passwords at the command line, those passwords are going to be captured in the clear. So, I mean, why would you want to use this? Well, you have to understand that this may not be right for everyone. But if you think about the other two options, if you don't have a way to manage your logs, this is a really nice alternative, because it's not going to be rolled over. It's not going to be purged out automatically. These are going to be files that you can capture and archive. So one way that is commonly used is to have logs written and then quickly sweep them off through scheduled tasks. And you can put them on like a common share, and you can lock that share down very heavily so that you can do something like this scheduled task maybe once an hour or once every 10 minutes or once a day, whatever schedule you determine. We'll sweep those logs to a share, and you can say, I can only write to that share. I can't even go in and read the logs that I wrote to that share. And then you can lock that share down to just a few select individuals to be able to open and read those logs. You could take that many steps further. So now I'm collecting all this information and I'm putting it in a central log share. I can then zip those files down because they're text files. They're going to compress down to nothing. I can then take those zips and I can move them to another location, or I can just let them back up to tape or to my backup service and then purge them off and then recall them when I need them. The point is you're building an activity log that you can refer to later. It may not be for you, but it's an option you have that's different than event logging.
We have a question, Mike. Is this different than Start Transcript?
No, it's the exact same thing. The only difference is you're turning it on via your policy, and you're basically saying turn it on all the time. So it's the same basic idea. Actually, it's exactly the same. There is no difference. And I'm going to have a log here that you're going to show in a second. So for those that are unfamiliar, you can put transcription on yourself. If you start up a PowerShell session and you say, I'm about to do something that I really would love to know the series of events I'm going to do because I may need to do this later, I can start transcript and that will begin a recording of all the command line activity, and then I can stop transcript and that will dump all that activity out from memory to a log. That is the exact same process that is happening here when we turn transcription on via group policy. And we simply say, I want to turn it on or turn it off. And again, it's a group policy, so I can decide to configure it for all machines, just a few machines, specific groups, OUs, sites. And then I pick where I want it to go. And there are defaults that you can pick, and you can have it dumped to the documents directory. There's lots of choices. You can also have it write directly to a share on your network. I will tell you that I could not get that to work. There's some security there that you really got to finesse to make sure that works right. It was easier to put the logs locally and sweep them off. And again, this has an option to grab invocation headers, and that is a little bit more important in this case. I'll explain why in a second. So this is what a transcription log looks like. And if you were to run start transcript on your machine and open up the log, it would be identical. So the log starts with PowerShell transcript. Here's the name of the computer, some randomness, and then this is the date. So we can see here, here's our start time, and you can see that that matches up here, right? We can also see a computer name here, matches up here, just so you understand, because these are not very friendly names up here. So we see the time that our session started, and I'm going to explain this in a second. There's some nuance here you need to understand. Who ran it and who they ran as well as information about the session that ran that. And then if you see down here, if you remember back to a few slides ago, the exact detail of my console output. More so than any of the other logging options. Now, I mentioned to you in an earlier slide this invocation headers. That takes a little bit of detail to understand. Understand that you may come in the morning and fire up a PowerShell session. If you have transcription turned on, the computer will start recording everything that happens in that session. However, if you're like me, the first thing I do in the morning is start a PowerShell session, and it goes until the end of the day. And sometimes, if I go home, I sleep my computer, and I leave that session open, and I go home and I start the computer, and the session is still open, and I'm still authenticated locally, not remotely, but the session never ended. This start time here is the start of the session. If my session is open for 10 hours and I run 100 commands, I have no way of knowing the timing of when those individual commands ran. When I invoke this here, when I check this off, this is going to say, let me know every time a command was run. So then what I'm going to have, and unfortunately I don't have it for you here in examples, I'm going to have the start time of the session as well as a timestamp right before every command. So think about that. If you have 10 hours of a session being recorded and you're trying to figure out what someone else is doing, it might be useful to know that they did these 5 commands within 2 minutes and the next 5 commands they did over 2 hours. So I would recommend that if you're going to think about this, you probably just want to check that off. So it's just adding additional information to the log. So those are the logging options that are available. And when we talked about remoting, we talked about a very sort of on-off, and then there's a few options to configure about who and where. In logging, it's really whatever you choose. You have 3 different options. As I said, 2 of those write to the event logs, and one of them produces flat text files. You got to be careful with that flat file because it can be something that comes back to bite you. There's a lot of information in there that you don't want to be available to everyone. The logs can fill up an event log quickly, so you have to accommodate for that. And one thing that I forgot to mention earlier that I'm going to say right now is when you log, you're logging more than what you just do. Remember, the commands that we use when we run PowerShell are the same commands that PowerShell and other products use, same commands that Microsoft and other products use to do their work behind the scenes. Run SCCM, that SCCM client on the machine is running PowerShell behind the scenes. Exchange, PowerShell. AD, PowerShell. Other tools, SharePoint, things like that, PowerShell. So you're going to capture all that activity in logs in addition to what your users are doing. So you really have to think about what it is you want to do, because you could end up having a needle in a haystack situation where I have so much information to look through that it's almost impossible to find what I'm looking for. So that's why I say the right combination of logging really is up to you. There is no way to do it that works for everyone. I will say that if I had a choice, script block logging is the way to go. It's the best happy medium of the 3 options. I really like transcription, but you've really got to be careful with that one because you're basically capturing the most sensitive information to a permanent log. And I didn't mention it earlier, but those transcription logs stick around until you decide to get rid of them. They don't take up a lot of space. So if you turn it on and you don't do anything for a year, it's a lot of information for someone to pick through. And if you use the default locations, an attacker may know where exactly to look for the logs. So something to think about there. So I've been saying a lot of information. I haven't stopped in a while, so let's take a little breather here. Is there anything I can answer for people? Because I'm effectively done. I'm just going to do a little wrap-up here. I'd be happy to answer any questions or go over anything that was unclear. Is there anything I can help with? All right. So with that being said, let's wrap it all up. So remember, we talked about remoting and logging, and the goal was to sort of educate you so that you understand how it all works. You don't have to know every detail, but if you can talk about these things with a little bit of confidence, you're much better off than you were an hour and 2 minutes ago. How you secure remoting depends on the security posture. How secure remoting is depends on your end nodes. Remoting relies on secure protocols and AD authentication to do its work, and it's super simple to configure. It's a simple one-line command in PowerShell console, or you could do it through group policy to do it at scale. If you wanted to go crazy, you could capture every command on the computer on every computer, but you're going to have to deal with the ramifications of increased logs and CPU overhead that's going to come with logging. As I just said, there's not really a size that fits for everybody. You're going to have to figure out the best options that work for you. But the point is, if you can sit down and have these conversations with your security team, they're going to believe in you a lot more if you can talk intelligently about these things. But I hope more than anything, the one thing you get out of this is that remoting is safe. And not only is it safe to use, you should be enabling it because, first of all, it allows you to do your job better. And if you have it on and you turn on logging, if something has happened, remoting is the most secure thing that Microsoft has offered for remote connections. It's safer than anything they've done before. It also has a level of detail that hasn't existed before. So by using remoting, logging the information, you can work in an effective manner, and if there's a problem, you can retrace the steps that someone else did, whether it be an attacker or your coworker who made a mistake. So I would encourage you to think about enabling remoting, turning on some logging, doing some testing, and figuring out the right settings for you. But I hope you realize at the end of this talk that this isn't something you should be afraid of. So with that, I've got one more slide I want to show you guys, but that's going to be it for my chat tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. I will finish up by saying a little plug for myself and the group that I run. Mike and I were talking earlier about PowerShell Saturday in Chattanooga that just happened. My group is doing a Saturday in approximately 40 days. We'd love for you to be there if you could. I got 18 speakers who will be presenting on various topics geared around PowerShell 101, PowerShell tools, and DevOps and security. We'll follow that up on a second day with a deep dive on cybersecurity with a gentleman named Fernando Tomlinson, who is the Director of Training for the U.S. Department of Defense CyberOps team in Augusta, Georgia. He's a very well-respected person in the security industry, and I think you would stand to learn a lot of information from him. He's going to be talking about things like blue teams and red teams and how you can use PowerShell for offensive and defensive techniques to help protect yourself. He'll talk about things with PowerShell code that could get you into trouble. It's a really great educational session, and we'd love to have you there. So if you're interested in attending, you really should look into getting tickets soon because there's not much time left, and you can get all the information you need on our website. And with that, I will say thank you very much. I hope you guys enjoyed this talk this evening, and it was a pleasure to be with you guys.